the Taoiseach, and the confusion between your two selves hardly adds to public confidence. And instead of managing the risks that we clearly face, you have now pursued what is a reckless policy with virtually no checks and balances. So you finally, in the small hours or late last night, published your green list, in which you itemised 15 countries and territories for which you have reduced the security profile. You have put yourselves at odds with the public health advice, which is for no international travel. And you have at once said to the public that you can travel with reduced risks, but please do not do so. Ordinary people have been thrown under the bus, Taoiseach. They face the situation that those that listen to the public health advice and forego their holidays are potentially out of pocket by thousands of euro. Those that do not heed the public health advice and do travel will do so uninsured. The other problem, Taoiseach, is that you haven't produced a red list. Those countries and zones where there is a very high prevalence of this virus, and there is a deep concern that people are travelling onto this island from those places, and when they do arrive here, they're asked simply to fill out a form and to restrict their movements. No isolation, no proper form of quarantine. So putting a form online, Taoiseach, isn't going to address any of this. And can I just remind you that the bottom line outside of holiday season is to get our children back to school, to get people back to education, to get people back to work safely, to keep them at work safely. So we need to get back to basics, and you need to have a proper plan and strategy. So can I ask you two questions? Firstly, what will you do to support those families who do listen to the public health advice, who do not travel internationally, and who find themselves out of pocket, in some cases by thousands of euros? And secondly, what are you doing to protect public health on the island from travel into the country from those places with a very high prevalence of the virus? What proper, operable, effective quarantine and safety measures will you put in place?
Taoiseach, please.
Thank the Deputy for her response, or for her question. I would just say at the outset that when I was Leader of the Opposition myself, I saw my role to be essentially one of a constructive contribution to protecting public health and rising above partisan political sniping. But that said, the leaders of the opposition suggested I was at odds with the Taoiseach, which I'm not. But I have to put it to the Deputy that she seems to be at odds with herself, because I'm clear the safest thing to do is not to travel. That's the clear message. We're saying to people to holiday at home this year. And we have, in the respect of those 15 countries, applied the normal precautions appellation in terms of the Department of Foreign Affairs, which basically means when they return home, they will not have to restrict their movements. Now, when I mentioned the Deputy and her party had a view that it was okay to open up the island to 59 countries. That is a fact. The Northern Ireland Executive signed up a fortnight ago to an opening up of the island. We're taking a much more conservative approach here. We're in the 15 countries, all of them would have less than 5 in 100,000 cases. They're actually safer right now, if I use that phrase, or have a lower incidence, to be more accurate, than we do here in the Republic. Now, I did point that out, and I understand that there are different jurisdictions and all of that, but this was signed off by Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, and that has to be said. But I'm still willing to work constructively to see how can we protect the island, because it raises challenges for us. And what we decided last evening was to move the passenger locator form to an electronic basis. Because actually the key, if we're honest, is testing and contact tracing. That still remains the gold standard in terms of trying to suppress the virus. And the timing of engagement, the quicker and the speedier you can contact a person who is maybe a contact of someone who has tested positive for COVID-19, that is the key response actually to determine our future capacity to keep on top of the virus. And I'd also make the point, and it has to be said, that in the first 12 days last July, in 2019, we were looking at about 1.469 million people arriving in through Dublin Airport. The figure this July is about 134,000 people. Now, there's been a lot of hype about the travel. There's been a lot of concern about it. I acknowledge the concern. But we need to keep it in perspective. 91% drop in travel
Thank you,
in and
Taoiseach.
out of Dublin Airport in the first 12 days of July between this year and last year. And so then the issue, as I said yesterday, is how do we live with COVID over the next 12 to 15 months in the absence of a vaccine?
Thank you, Taoiseach. Time is up.
And that's something that should exercise all of us in this House in terms of the broader challenges facing society.
Deputy MacDonald.
Anna, I do hope that the Taoiseach desist from the type of sniping that you have described, Taoiseach. Can I say to you, firstly, that we absolutely need an all-island approach? And I hope that the North-South Ministerial Council meeting next week will provide an opportunity for Dublin to step forward, to stop being passive and to actually champion that very approach. Our position is well known within the five-party executive, and our position is that we need every protection for the island as a single unit. And that means effective quarantining methods, not placing a form online and championing this as some great transformational intervention. It is not. It is about testing. It is about tracing. It is about isolating. It is about having effective and robust procedures for those 134,000 people who have arrived on our island. Currently, that is not the case, and well, you know it. Can I also say that in respect of families here and their holiday plans, the Irish Travel Agents Association estimate that €800,000 a day is being lost by consumers. Because you see, that's the immediate, these are the immediate people who are caught in the crossfire of this. Government have done precious little to intervene on behalf of those families who do heed the public health advice and who do choose to holiday at home. Can I ask you again, how and when will you intervene for these, families?
Taoiseach, please.
Well, in the first instance, in terms of the all-island question that you put, I will work towards achieving the maximum synergy between the Northern Ireland Executive and our government in relation to the suppression of the virus on the island of Ireland. That's very important. But I do acknowledge the de facto situation in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the Northern Executive and the fact that it is connected to the public health advice in the UK. And that there are issues we should acknowledge in that respect, because people will say it should be all Ireland in a throwaway phrase, and that we all agree with that. But the reality of doing that is clearly challenging. And I think the joint memorandum between the Chief Medical Officer in the North and in the Republic is good. And that's a good welcome start. The North-South Ministerial Council will give us a further opportunity now, and I welcome the fact that we're having it at the end of July for the first time in 3.5 years. That will give us an opportunity to create structures to discuss these things. Because we did discuss travel last week in a constructive way, and I just made the point that we were concerned about travel. I made that point, and that everybody needed to keep a watchful eye, North and South, on the travel situation. We are now strengthening our position in relation to incoming travel, low and all as it is in comparison with what went prior to COVID. In relation to your question on supporting and people and so on, again, there have been very significant and unprecedented supports through the pandemic unemployment payment, through the wage subsidy, in terms of the population in general. We haven't come forward with specific proposals in relation to compensation of those who perhaps had to cancel holidays that they booked some time ago. And we, in terms of the stimulus programme, will be developing significant initiatives again to support the hospitality and tourism sector in Ireland. And via means that will help ordinary citizens as well to avail of such hospitality and tourism facilities in Ireland. And
thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the regional group, Deputy Verona Murphy.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Ceann Comhairle, Rosslare Europort is acknowledged as Ireland's most strategic port. In fact, it was made a border inspection post, second only to Dublin because of this. Yet no government has applied for it to have a Tier 1 status, and it can access finance for supports from the EU on infrastructural development in line with its strategic position. In the programme for government of 2016, under the heading, and I quote, "Attracting Jobs and Investment, 10T Funding," in the first 3 months the new government will apply to the EU for the revision of the 10T core network, including applying for the reinstatement of the cross-border Western Arc, which included Rosslare Europort. This never happened, and the current programme for government of 2020 doesn't mention it either. Ceann Comhairle, it would follow, if the reason for adding Rosslare to the core network was to create jobs and investment, then not to do so will result in the loss of jobs and investment. It won't stop there, Ceann Comhairle. The government's negligence in not applying to the EU to make Rosslare a core network port like Dublin and Foynes will result in the failure to keep Ireland's exports and imports competitive. Commercial traffic will slow down because of increased regulation when Brexit is upon us at the end of the year. And as an island nation, 90% of goods are moved by roll-on, roll-off freight services. The road freight transport sector will be subject to the new EU legislation known as the Mobility Package, which is detrimental to Ireland because of our geographic location on the periphery of mainland EU. The need for a daily direct service to circumvent the chaos of the land bridge will never be greater. These calls have been ignored, and to continue doing so will lead to a huge increase in delays, leading to an increase in cost to the land bridge that won't work. The people of Ireland will be unforgiving when rising consumer costs for the most basic of items like bread and sugar, as well as job losses, could have been avoided. Ceann Comhairle, what I'd ask the Taoiseach is to tell the country why they're neglecting to take actions that should be taken in relation to keeping the country from catastrophe now and post-Brexit.
Thank you very much, Deputy Taoiseach.
I want to thank the Deputy for her question and raising the key issues pertaining to Rosslare Europort. And in the context of Brexit, the government is acutely aware of the necessity to work with the port and the department and offices responsible in preparing for the additional border controls and other impacts that will arise from Brexit. And we acknowledge the role of Rosslare in that regard. And the Deputy is correct that given the challenges and difficulties that will arise in relation to the land bridge post-Brexit, we need to make sure that we utilise and maximise all available facilities and capacity that we have. Now, in relation to the Tier 1 proposal, I think the Deputy is aware as to how all of that developed back in 2013 in terms of the designation of ports on the basis of overall tonnage. I think at the time Rosslare would have had 2.5%. Our ports are responsible, ports generally, the Tier 2 ports were 2.5% of overall tonnage to Irish ports. The Tier 1s were about 15 to 20%. Now, post-Brexit, the situation is changing, and we do have to diversify our approach. And we are, I know Rosslare Port has been involved with the County Council and with private sector interests, and are also seeking a free zone in that area, particularly anxious to exploit the forthcoming opportunities that wind energy will present. And that's something that we would be interested in terms of combining both opportunities, because there will be significant investment in wind energy over the next number of years, and ports will play an important role in terms of servicing such activity. But I do hear the Deputy in relation to the fundamental point of moving from Tier 1 to Tier 3, but that's something that obviously has broader implications in terms of port policy in general. There is the ongoing, I think, issue which we're all aware of in terms of the ownership of the port and structures governing it. It's unique, as we know, among the state commercial ports, and that's something that I think we should work on in terms of creating a better status for the port into the future.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Murphy.
Thank you, Count Corla. Just on your comments, Taoiseach, in relation to the ownership, it's not an obstacle to something like applying for Tier 1 status, and given that it was in the programme for government in 2016 to apply for Tier 1 for Rosslare, I think that it should be re-entered into this programme for government. And just to remind you that fines actually didn't meet the requirements either. It's intimated that it more had to do with the position of the Finance Minister coming from the same county at the time. But just to move on, I appreciate your comments in relation to the free zone. You'll know that Britain is preparing to apply for 10 free zones post-Brexit, and to prepare them for the backlash of leaving the EU. So I'm proposing that Rosslare Europort become a free zone to allow an intake of stored goods and supplies that up to now it was not necessary because of the customs union. We tend not to store product. We must capitalise where possible and make Rosslare a free zone, which is the smartest way to allay fears that cash flows will be eaten up on duties and taxes on goods in storage, which will only serve to drive up costs again, and if that storage is not contained in a free zone. The land is available around Rosslare, the interest has been muted, as you said, and Brexit makes it a necessity. So if you wouldn't mind a further comment on whether or not it is the intention to create a free zone to combat 10 free zones being prepared by the UK. Thank you,
Deputy Murphy. Taoiseach.
At this stage, what I can confirm is that we will give that we will examine, obviously, that and we'll give it our very considered attention. As you know, at the moment, Rosslare Europort is undergoing a major transformation as part of its ports master plan, and that will see over €30 million invested in customer facilities, port infrastructure, assets and new technology by the Port Authority, Éire Nord Éirden, over the course of the next 5 years. And that's essentially in terms of the modernisation and digitalisation of the port itself. As I said, we have to re-examine broader policy as a result of Brexit. And so it's in that context that I take note of your comments in relation to Tier 1 to Tier 2, Tier 2 to Tier 1 status. But also I want to do so in an informed way and in a structured way, and it has to be in the context of broader port policy. But I do appreciate the Deputy's concerns in this regard, and also the Deputy's focus on the proposal around the free zone, which can be, there are free zones secured within, secured custom areas within the European Union, and that's something we will work with the various stakeholders here to see how that proposal can be progressed.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Now, a third question comes from Deputy Richard O'Donoghue of the Rural Independent Group.
Thank you, Caleb. Taoiseach, in the programme for government, I would like to highlight the section on building stronger and safer communities. Page 84 of your own document. Quote, "Community safety is at the heart of the ongoing transformation of the Garda Síochána. The new government will ensure that this will be a key part in the social contract with citizens. Garda Síochána, enriched with its resilience, links in the area and the people it works with and protects." End of quote. There must be a proper clarity regarding the protection of all our citizens, especially children following the recent COVID. It has come to my attention in my constituency that various people are coming either back from holidays or from working abroad in the UK, Germany and other countries, and are not isolating. We must look after the children and the families that are staying at home in Ireland and not travelling for holidays. When looking through the programme for government regarding community safety, I must ask you, how will returning to school be policed? There are people travelling by air and by ferries. There must be a system linked to passport numbers so pupils can be, so schools can be alerted in advance of children that should be isolating. I also have an additional question. Where parents are travelling for work and returning home to families, these children may need to stay out of school while parents are isolating. We are fast approaching September, and isolating for children would have to have commenced by the middle of August, so that these children can go back to school.
Deputy Taoiseach.
Well, as we have said and consistently said, the safest thing to do during COVID-19 right now is not to travel and to holiday in Ireland and to stay at home. And one of our overarching priorities, and why we've taken a very cautious approach, particularly in terms of the recommencement of phase 4, for example, and in relation to compulsory wearing of masks on public transport, which I ensured happened the week before last, and which the public complied with very, very quickly. It's very, very important. And all of that was based on the overarching objective of getting our schools open at the end of August. I think that's essential for the well-being of the children of the nation, their development, and I think to me it's the number one priority. And alongside of it, the resumption of non-COVID strand of health services. So in my view, there are clear guidance there in terms of anyone who travels outside of those 15 countries that we've identified should restrict their movements when they return to Ireland, and without question. And in our view, they should, we don't want families travelling to holidays outside of those 15 countries in the first place. And it's very, very important that they don't risk the capacity of schools to open, or indeed create situations where which could lead to the spread of the virus. So it's extremely important that all of our that we adhere to the guidance and the guidelines. Ireland has done well in relation to COVID-19. The levels are still low in Ireland. It's important to make that point. And when I was just back from the European Council, it was noticeable that some member states are finding difficulties in reopening. And as they have reopened, the incident rate has increased significantly in some countries, resulting in localised lockdowns, city-wide lockdowns as well. We want to avoid that in Ireland at all costs. And that really speaks to two things: our own individual behaviour as families, communities, and aligned to that then the need, as I said earlier, to develop a very strong, speedy testing and contact tracing system. And to be fair, in the last month alone, a very substantial number of tests have taken place on a systemic basis within nursing homes, for example, across the country. And that type of targeted work will continue. But it's the speed of that service will be very, very important in enabling us to suppress the spread of the virus into the future.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy O'Donoghue.
Thank you, Taoiseach, and I agree with everything that you have said, but from my point of view is the best way forward for this is anyone leaving this country, and we need an all-Ireland approach, anyone leaving this country by air or by ferry, that the passport number should be linked. It is the fastest way to be policed, because the policing of this pandemic using a passport system is the fastest way to track anybody leaving this country and coming into this. That's children, parents, everyone is tracked leaving, everyone is tracked coming back. So it makes the traceability for the Garda Síochána and for everyone, that they can actually trace people when they come back into the country. And for the likes of our schools going forward, it shows when families are returning, and if a member of a family is returning to a household and has been abroad in one of the high-risk areas outside of the 15, that family then has to isolate and not put the other children in the school systems at risk. The majority of people in Ireland are very cognizant of COVID-19, are very respectful, but we do have a minority of people that do not care, and these are the minority people that we have to police. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach. To conclude,
well, the electronic locator form will give us that capacity to follow-up contacts of anyone who has tested positive of COVID-19. And people travelling from areas such as you reference would be jeopardising, the potential would be jeopardising certainly the overall health status of a community or a school. So what's very important is that we have the capacity to contact trace people, and I think the electronic form will give us that to a stronger degree, but also the call centre that we decided last night to establish, which will enable rapid follow-up. The key advice internationally and from the World Health Organization is your capacity to contact people quickly who may have been in contact with somebody who had COVID-19 or has COVID-19. That really is the issue. If we're to live with COVID-19 in a reasonable way that allows activity, that allows people to, as much as possible, to engage in the normal family, community, economic things of life. And so more and more people will pick on, go to this sector or that sector. The fundamentals haven't changed in relation to COVID-19. Etiquette, the hand washing, the social distancing, the guidance that we introduced 2 weeks ago in terms of keeping gatherings in households to 10, for example. Those are the essentials that will ultimately enable us to live reasonably with COVID-19 into the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. We move now to the final question from Deputy Michael McNamara on behalf of the Independent Group.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, at the end of this week it will be a month since you were elected Taoiseach. I commended your election as Taoiseach. I thought the country badly needed a government at the time. It was a government that was needed to make decisions. Up to now, those decisions have been slow in coming. I appreciate that many of the issues that you've had to deal with have been complex, but nevertheless, the decisions have been slow. One of the issues that I raised was around Shannon. The Shannon Group, its importance beyond Clare but across the entire Midwest. Shannon Airport is in great difficulty, as is the aviation sector generally. There's a lot of confusion around quarantining rules. The previous speaker called for people to self-isolate. There's a lot of concern and a growing hostility in the country that incoming tourists are flouting our laws. The Irish Times, no less, had an article last Saturday saying that the Gardaí needed to implement our laws. But the reality is, Taoiseach, there's no law to implement. There is no legal requirement to quarantine for anybody coming into this country, regardless of where they come from. And I wonder why that is. Is it based on the legal requirements of being in the EU? Of course, we can limit freedom of movement within the EU and freedom of travel, but to do so it has to be proportionate and it has to be clear, it has to be done lawfully. In Ireland, there's a question as to whether it's either proportionate or lawful, because the entire burden is being put back on ordinary people rather than the state actually doing what the state is able to do, which is to bring in laws. If we think people shouldn't be coming from Italy, then maybe make them quarantine. But we are allowing people to go to Italy. Italy is not the issue. But there are other countries like the United Kingdom, or at least parts of the United Kingdom, the United States and many other countries, and I want to know why that isn't being done. But more importantly, Taoiseach, I want to ask, what are you going to do outside of the aviation sector in Shannon? Because we're asking people to holiday at home, and many people are. And many people are foregoing sums of money that they saved up so that they could go on holidays, but they're foregoing that. Are they going to get any help from the government in that regard? And why are planes taking off from Dublin and Shannon to areas that we deem not to be safe? Again, if it's a requirement of EU law, spell it out and spell it out clearly, Taoiseach. Because the effect of it is that Aer Lingus and Ryanair are flying those planes so that they can say to people, you are not at, your flight is going whether you go or not, and you know, it is increasingly looking like sort of that ordinary people have to bear the brunt of everything, and that big corporations can continue to do as they would like, make no refunds whatsoever, and nothing is happening. And finally, if I have another couple of seconds, I would ask Shannon Heritage, Taoiseach, I raised it here. We're now approaching the end of July. Craigenown hasn't opened at all this summer. Shannon Group appear not to want.
Thank you, Deputy.
Shannon
Time
Heritage.
is up.
What
Taoiseach.
are you doing with regard to these issues, Taoiseach?
Taoiseach.
Well, first of all, I would say thank the Deputy for his questions, and I would say that the first number of weeks have been extremely decision-oriented. As I said before, I've never come across a legislative programme so significant in 1 month, and it's through the cooperation of everybody in the House that we're putting through very substantive and very significant legislation, which is the substance of politics and the substance of government and Parliament. That's ultimately why we are here. And I think that legislation will underpin the July stimulus programme that we'll be announcing this week, which hopefully may be of some assistance to the heritage issue that you've raised, and perhaps giving additional capacity and supports to enable people to deal with the crisis that COVID-19 has brought about. And to be fair, you have raised that issue very consistently. And also the issue of the Shannon Group and Shannon Airport. And the problem we know in aviation is the fact that travel has collapsed. Despite all of the talk and all of the headlines around travel, the reality is, as I said, from the 1st to the 12th of July last year, we had 1.4 to 69 million people in and out of Dublin Airport. This month, a year on, it's 134,000. That's why aviation is on the floor. And that's a huge challenge, which government is very aware of in terms of working with the airlines and working with the airports. And I would say to you, in terms of the mandatory quarantine, this has been articulated for quite some time. It's impossible to enforce in the first instance. And secondly, it's questionable as to whether it's the wise approach. Because in some countries where they brought in mandatory quarantining, it actually led to a cluster developing where the actual quarantining was taking place. That happened. That did happen. And the advice we've got, and we've discussed this with WHO and others, is that really the issue is you must be able to contact people very, very quickly once they've arrived into the country. I'm responding to Deputy McNamara. Deputy Lou MacDonald got an opportunity to answer, and I really think you should allow others their time on leaders' questions. You don't own the entire Parliament, and I think you should allow other opposition deputies to have their say. I say that in good form, you know, but Deputy McNamara that is the essence of it, and I think just walk through the logic of it. Think through the logic of mandatory quarantining. You know, how many hotels would the state be booking? You know, and the proportionate point that you made is very valid. And there are complex legal issues involved. But essentially, contact tracing, knowing where people are, and that's where the electronic locator form comes into play. That's the importance of that, to enable us to have a ready capacity to contact people who may have been in contact with someone who tested positive.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
I think that is actually the better approach in relation to that, and we will work with you in terms of the other issues that you raise in terms of Shannon Airport, the Shannon Group, and particularly the heritage.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Deputy McNamara, Deputy.
Yeah, I suppose, Taoiseach, you mentioned legislation, and I agree. I mean, you know, there are a growing number of people in the country, and there's, I think, a certain amount of hostility being encountered by tourists because people think they're flouting laws when they're not. And we need to be very clear either these people are flouting laws or they're not flouting laws. The second point I want to, you mentioned legislation. Will we see legislation to move Shannon Heritage from a group which clearly doesn't want it anymore to a better home where it might be looked after and where the tourist potential of these sites will be exploited, not for the profit of these sites themselves, but rather for the businesses around them, the small family-owned businesses around them that are dependent upon it? And lastly, Taoiseach, will we see a new board appointed to Shannon Airport that will bring the Shannon Group, which is not just the airport, but at the moment the heritage sites, the airport and Shannon Commercial Properties, which will bring the strategic vision and direction necessary for this very important group to move forward.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach, to conclude.
Those are issues I'd like to discuss with the Deputy in greater detail in terms of a fundamental point in terms of moving Shannon Heritage to a better home. Obviously, that would take some detailed examination, but I do note that you are very, very concerned about its current operations in terms of the low level of activity, the impact on employment, and I would hope perhaps there might be opportunities arising out of the stimulus package that may be of interest and of use to Shannon Heritage. I would speak to the Minister for Tourism in terms of the issues that you've raised, and also obviously in relation to the Minister of Transport in terms of the wider and more fundamental questions that you've asked in relation to Shannon Airport itself, and also in terms of the appointment of a board.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. That concludes Leaders' questions. We move now to questions on promised legislation. 43 deputies have indicated. Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Ciarán Comhairle. Taoiseach, I want to ask you about the HICWA report into nursing homes. Very damning observations in which it is absolutely apparent that nursing homes did not conform to any satisfactory level of clinical governance. We're left without human resources, practical resources necessary to protect residents and indeed staff. And we know how all of that ended. It ended with so many people losing their lives and so many families to this day shattered by that traumatising experience. Taoiseach, we need to know exactly what happened in the nursing homes because we need to put right the wrongs of the last number of months. We need to prepare ourselves for the real possibility of a second surge. We need to prepare ourselves for the autumn time and the winter, and we need to be absolutely sure that those living in nursing homes are properly cared for and that their families and the wider community has that confidence. So
Thank you, Deputy.
I want to propose that we establish a special Oireachtas committee to speedily, efficiently and compassionately examine exactly what happened in our nursing homes. I want to propose, Taoiseach, that you would support the establishment of this Oireachtas committee and that we do the work now and throughout August to ensure that this committee can speedily work so that we learn the lessons and that families have some platform for their very real experiences to be recorded and responded to.
Taoiseach.
Well, I think it's a very important and very serious report from HICWA, and we will examine that in considerable detail. And I think some of the issues in its 45-page report are concerning in terms of breaches of regulations, management failings, staff shortages, lack of infection control measures, and that was after dozens of inspections at homes with confirmed cases since May. And I think we sometimes don't acknowledge the role of HICWA in terms of its regulatory functions, a body which I established quite some time ago. And I think it has brought about reforms in health through its regulatory rigour, which it has applied to all settings without fear or favour. Not always popular because of that, but nonetheless an important vehicle towards reforming. Now, the Minister has informed me that the expert review report on all of this in the nursing homes in the context of COVID should be on the Minister's desk next week. I think with the publication of that, and we should then liaise with all parties as to next steps in relation to that. But in the first instance, we need to seek to learn the lessons so that when issues may arise again, hopefully they won't if we can avoid it, in terms of a second spike in the autumn and with the flu seasons and so on, that we learn those lessons and apply them. That's the spirit within which I want to approach this, and also to make sure that we take medium-term lessons in terms of how we reform the care of the elderly into the future and have a broader range of support options for families and for people.
Deputy Duncan Smith, please.
Taoiseach, on the issue of climate, if the government's to reach its own target of producing 70% of its electricity from renewable resources, wind energy and offshore wind energy is going to play a real role in that. So my question is in relation to the Marine Planning, Development and Management Bill. When is that? It was due for Q3 of this year. What are its plans? Can you provide us with any timelines on when that's going to be presented to the House? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Very keen in terms of the development of offshore wind. I think it's going to be a key contributor to our energy capacity into the future and in terms of meeting our climate change agenda. So that legislation hopefully will be published in the autumn, probably towards the latter part of the year.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Jennifer Whitmore.
Thank you. Taoiseach, we are 5 weeks away from schools opening. We are 1 week away from taking recess, and yet there is still no clear certainty on how the schools are going to open. Children don't know if they're going to be in with their school friends for an entire week or part of a week. Parents don't know if they're going to need to source childcare for part of the week, and schools and principals and teachers don't know what level of supports and funding they're going to get. So, Taoiseach, when will you be publishing a clear plan for schools to reopen at the end of the month, including a funding structure for those schools? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
I want to assure the Deputy that this is an absolute priority of the government to get the schools reopened. A lot of work has been underway, working with all of the stakeholders, which is important. And I prefer one comprehensive announcement in relation to this, as opposed to piecemeal announcements or responding and so on. This needs to be a comprehensive response. A lot of work is underway by the department itself, the stakeholders in education, and the minister. And the minister is very keen, obviously, to make a public, comprehensive statement on this when everything has been put together, including funding and including the arrangements that will apply.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Taoiseach, in the programme for government, in the section on health, the programme said, and I quote, the government's priority is to protect public health by following public health advice. Now, on the day that another frontline health worker has tragically lost their life as a result of COVID-19, do you really think it is a good time to start abandoning adherence to the public health advice of NPHET on the issue of foreign travel? It really is quite extraordinary what is going on. Simon Coveney this morning said he was going to make things clear and then went on to further muddy already murky waters by saying, we don't want you to go, we'd prefer if you didn't go, but you can go. That's essentially what the advice is. Like arriving at a set of traffic lights and the green light and the red light are simultaneously illuminated.
Well, the red light is on now,
It's
Deputy.
confusing. It is confusing, and clearly it is not in line with the public health advice being issued by NPHET on foreign travel.
Thank you, Deputy. Time is up.
How do you explain that?
I think you're overstating the issue, Deputy, and I think we take the issue in terms of travel and its potential contributory effect to COVID very seriously. That's why we have one of the most restrictive travel frameworks globally. We are very restrictive in this country in terms of the numbers of people coming into the country and the advice we have given people. And people, by and large, have complied with that advice. Hence, relative to what happened before COVID, the very low numbers that are travelling, either in or out of the country. But it is important, though, that, in terms of people are travelling to countries that, in my view, have very high incidence of COVID. And it's important to say that there are other countries there that have a lower incidence of COVID than we have ourselves. I think there has to be a consistency of message there as well.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Time's up.
The key point, again, have to reiterate, it's the testing and the contact tracing and having strong measures at our airports to protect people from
Thank you,
COVID-19.
Deputy Matthew McGrath.
Taoiseach, you described the deal that we got at the weekend as a good deal for Europe. Only 4 countries, Germany, France, Holland and Sweden, have to contribute more than us. And when we look at Germany, they in actual fact pay €1,660 per head per capita. We in Ireland are going to pay €3,201 per head. This is a rotten deal. After the miserable so-called bailout, I called it at the time a clean-out. This is another bad deal. The frugal fours were very, very strong, and the frugal five. They were right because they got write-offs. We have the good boys in Europe, the lapdogs, and we say, oh yeah, everything's grand. Give us the punishment, we'll take it. And we end up being screwed. Pardon the expletive. It's a disgraceful deal, and we cannot accept this. And our people shouldn't be burdened with this. Our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And it's a shocking indictment on a so-called solidarity in Europe, and I think it's a disgrace. And it's time that we took off the gloves and wasn't the good boys in Europe, and to be up there now as the second highest per head of population.
Thank you, Deputy.
Over only Denmark. Thank you.
Taoiseach.
I don't know what planet you're on, Deputy. I genuinely don't. I mean this sincerely. I mean, our membership of the European Union isn't about being good boys or bad boys. It's about being part of a single market and an economic union that has brought great benefits to the country in terms of jobs and in terms of the modernisation of our economy. This deal is a good deal for Ireland. I mean, the common agricultural policy element of this, actually, the proportion of the multi-annual financial framework for the common agricultural policy has gone up to 31% as opposed to 28% in the last programme. Now, when you take the United Kingdom's exit from Europe and the huge contribution it was making, that is a very, very significant outcome for Ireland. We are now net contributors, Deputy, but for almost 50 years of our membership, we were net recipients. I'd say it's up to 40 or 50 billion. I don't have the exact figure. I'll get it for you. I mean, we are part, but it's not about that, actually. No, as far as I'm concerned, it's about we being able, hold on, we would not survive on our own as an island in isolation. We survive and create wealth in Ireland through making products, providing services that provide solutions to the global economy and the global societies, and enable us to sell the beef, the milk, the software, and a variety, hundreds of other services and goods that make Ireland the economically developed country that it has been since our membership of the European Union.
Please, Deputy Joan Collins.
Taoiseach, you'd be aware that during the last Dáil, the government supported the restructuring of our money advice, budgetary services and the citizens' information. It was hugely contentious and opposed by many of us here in the Dáil. Now, I just heard this morning that 2 services, MABS offices in Francis Street, in Dublin 8 and in Crumlin, have been told that they're closed from Friday and they're going to have to revert up to Tallaght. I think this is very, very serious, taking away these really important services for people in our communities and taking them out of the areas. And I'm wondering, do other TDs know that that's happening in their own area, because we hadn't a clue that this was going on. So I'd like the Taoiseach to intervene in this and find out exactly what's going on with MABS in relation to our local services, or the relevant minister to check it out, because it's outrageous.
Thank you, Deputy Collins. Taoiseach.
Well, 2 things. First of all, I'd like to get an evaluation of how that structural change of MABS has worked out in terms of the broader services. Generally, I'm talking about now, because I've got different feedback since it happened. Some positive earlier, some early in the year, when I met some people involved in the service in an informal way. I can't get involved in every operational decision of agencies under specific departments, and we will contact MABS to ascertain the rationale for this action and what the intention is.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Rory O'Murrough.
I wish to raise the HICWA report released yesterday about the overall situation in nursing homes during the COVID-19 outbreak. The report lays out in stark terms how nearly 60% of homes inspected following COVID-19 outbreaks were found to have insufficient infection prevention and control measures, which possibly led to greater tragedy. It spoke of deficiencies with governance and management. The report also spoke of unsuitability of some of these units during the pandemic and the need for upgrading. There were many horror stories from families and staff. I've spoken to Health Minister Stephen Donnelly about testing delays that have become evident in the last few days, including at Jalgan House in Dundalk. A few weeks ago, they were able to get COVID-19 test results within 5 hours, but it was almost 48 hours for 2 test results last week. I am told prioritised testing facilities that were available to Jalgan and other nursing homes are not now. This needs to be fixed. Some of the families who lost loved ones in Jalgan House wish to meet the new health Minister. 22 people died in the home during a COVID-19 outbreak. break. They want to tell them about the need for a public inquiry to ensure that all problems are arrested and that the questions that families and management have are answered.
All right,
I would like the Taoiseach to add his voice to this and ensure action in dealing with the problems listed in the Hickory report. And can he deal with the preparations for a second wave and with the necessary radical reform clearly needed in the nursing home sector?
Taoiseach.
Just as I said earlier, the expert review report in relation to nursing homes in the context of the pandemic will be, I think, on the Minister's desk next week, and we will obviously take measures to have that published and debated, and that will deal with the wider nursing home situation. Obviously, in terms of the testing, if you've spoken to the Minister, I'm sure the Minister will follow up in relation to the specifics of the query you raised in respect of Dundalgan. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Deputy Richard Bruton.
I think the Taoiseach will be well aware of the tragic killings that have occurred in the Coolock Garda district, and he'll also be aware from his time as Minister for Education that that is also an area which has the lowest progression to further education and higher education in the country. Former Assistant Commissioner Jack Nolan is just completing an evaluation of what needs to be done to address the complex issues in that area, and I really warmly welcome the commitment in the programme for government that the approach done in the North Inner City will be expanded to other such areas because it's far more than a policing issue. And my question to the Taoiseach is, will he and his office play the lead role in coordinating the work on such a response in areas like Coolock so that, as occurred in the North Inner City, it will be led from the centre of government?
Thank you, Deputy Bruton. Taoiseach.
Just first of all, I think that's a very constructive suggestion. I'll work with others, and I think it's an important point in terms of the the development of community initiatives like North Eastern Dublin and similar to the rapid programmes of before. In other words, a multidisciplinary concentrated approach to areas that have experienced significant disadvantage, and particularly where there's low levels of school completion. That's something that we must really attack in a combined way involving agencies and government departments. And I will examine the Deputy's proposal in relation to that. And just to say, in relation to your proposal last week on the order of business in terms of the utilisation of the public service, in terms of internships and that, I brought that to the very heart of government, to the Ministers for Finance and Public Expenditure in the context of the stimulus programme. Because I agree with you 100%. We need to give more opportunities for young people in the current crisis in respect of both public service opportunities and private sector.
Deputy Bernard Durkin.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. The Defence Amendment Bill is promised legislation. In that context, can I ask the Taoiseach whether it is intended to address the issues of manpower levels within the Defence Forces in the context of that bill, or if it is intended to do it separately in anticipation of that bill?
Taoiseach.
Well, we hope that the commission that's in the programme for government will be set up in the autumn, but we won't be wasting time in terms of moving to help the capacity of the Defence Forces to recruit and to retain staff more effectively. That's something that I'm very concerned about as Taoiseach. I know the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence is as well, and that's something we intend to take a proactive approach to.
Thank you. Deputy Neil Richmond. Not here. Deputy Carl Nolan.
Taoiseach, I want to raise the issue concerning, on page 46 of the programme for government, there is a commitment to ensure that work is done with the HSE to improve care. We have a situation where we have adults with disabilities unable to attend care services, and I know there was a lot of shock and dismay among many families when they heard last week that on the special COVID-19 committee it said that the services may not resume until next year. I would ask you to urgently prioritise this. Adults with disabilities have regressed significantly and they have been disrupted, and we need to make sure that the services are put back in place as soon as possible.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
I think that's a very fair point, and I'll certainly have a look at that with a view, because I think keeping people out of those services for that length of time isn't, in my view, the optimal response at all, and we have to do something in relation to that.
Deputy Brian Stanley.
question I want to ask the Taoiseach is about the commitment in the programme for government, page 114, to tackle inequality based on socio-economic background in the third level sector, Taoiseach. The issue of the income criteria is based on 2019, but of course a lot of families have seen huge changes in their financial situation since the start of the year, which you'll appreciate. There's workers who are without employment for the first time ever in their lives. So the assessment criteria doesn't correspond with reality of people's lives, and this needs to be reviewed in terms of their assessment for SUSI grants. I want you also to address the situation of the anomaly in the system. The case of Miss X in Laois is one example, who is a married woman, 23 years of age, living with her partner, who is her now husband, for 5.5 years, totally independent of her parents, and is still being assessed as a dependent child, despite having supplied reams of information to show that she is living independently with her partner and her now husband. There's an anomaly in the system, Taoiseach, that the officials in the department need to address.
Taoiseach, please.
It's a good department, but I do, in terms of education in particular, we should, generally speaking, my own philosophy has always been that we should be as flexible as possible to enable people to complete their education, because it's good for the person and it's good for society. So I can't obviously comment on the specifics of the case, but we can look at that. I take your comments in relation to the assessment for SUSI in terms of previous income. The Minister for Higher and Further Education last night, the government agreed with a package of measures to help students, particularly on low incomes, in terms of accessing and participating in third level education in the next
Thank you, Taoiseach.
session, particularly in terms of access to technology and doubling the disadvantaged grants scheme, which universities administer for students who are in financial difficulty, and particularly we're doing it this year because of the COVID impact.
All right, thank you,
Taoiseach.
Deputy David Cullinan, not here. Deputy Paul Murphy. Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, the programme for government promises to improve the lives of people with disabilities, and for the most important people in their lives, their carers. Next Wednesday from 12:30, carers, as part of the Enough is Enough campaign, will be outside the convention centre calling for just that. Concretely, they'll be calling for the reopening of adult day services. All around the country, carers are screaming out that they are physically and mentally exhausted, but they feel that nobody is listening. Will the government act on its promises? Will it publish definite guidelines for promptly reopening home support hours, respite services, adult day services and mental health services? Will it recognise the huge efforts of carers, which save the state over €10 billion a year, and raise carers allowance and carers benefit? Will it abolish the means test for carers? Will it suspend reviews of carers allowance? And finally, will it ensure that people with disabilities can legally demand their rights by immediately beginning the ratification of the optional protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities?
Deputy Martin Kenny on the same issue.
On the same issue, yeah, this is an issue I want to raise with the Taoiseach in regard to particularly adults with intellectual disabilities who are at home at the moment with elderly parents in many cases who are unable to cope, and it has been a situation that's gone on now through the COVID, and many people around the country are at their wits' end to know what to do, because the service that they use as a daycare service has been taken away, and even respite has been taken away from them. And across my constituency, and I'm sure across the whole country, carers and people who are looking after people in these circumstances really need to get some effort made from government to put the services back in place immediately.
Is it Deputy Cronin at the back?
Yes,
Rada Cronin.
Yeah, Taoiseach, I want to raise the same issue, the promised legislation for people living with intellectual disabilities. Under the old government, these became the new dispossessed, and we cannot allow that to become permanent. I have mothers in North Kildare contacting me about their children living with intellectual disabilities, about lack of respite and unacceptable delays in vital health services. The government signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2 years ago, but since then that signature has been moot and mute. The programme for government promises to ratify the optional protocol, which would mean that parents with children with intellectual disabilities wouldn't have to go to war every day with the state, and it would allow them to vindicate their children's rights.
Thank you,
When
Deputy.
are you going to ratify the optional protocol?
There's a number of questions there. First of all, in terms of the impact of COVID-19, it has been devastating on many, many families in many, many sectors. Our schools closed for quite a number of months as a result of COVID-19, and adult disability services also effectively closed in terms of people being able to go to their day centres and various other services. The challenge has always been, and particularly we know still, that congregated settings or numbers in indoor settings is problematic in relation to COVID. But that said, I think we have to work to make such services and centres available to adults with intellectual disabilities. And I will talk to the ministers involved in relation to this to see what the challenges are and with the service providers as well in terms of enabling the provision of some level of services for those who are affected by this. I think that is a fair point and is important. And in terms of children and special needs in general and participation in education, in response to Deputy Cronin's point, I think it's very important that we avoid adversarial approaches and that children as a right should have the appropriate school placements available to them, and that the proper planning in advance should take place. And I am working with the Minister of Education in that regard. In my view, we must introduce a greater degree of advocacy for the child within the system.
All right, thank you, Taoiseach. Time is up. Deputy Paul McAuliffe. Deputy McAuliffe is not here. Deputy Cathal Crowe.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Ceann Comhairle, the programme for government references unsewered rural villages. I want to raise one in County Clare, Broadford Village. It has a shovel-ready project. The land is acquired. It has been fully designed, but it has sat on the shelf for many, many years. At a time when we've had absurd discourse on the environment, stating that dairy herds are major polluters, the fact is there are still unsewered rural villages like Broadford, where you flush a toilet. At best, it goes into an antiquated septic tank. At worst, it goes into a soak gravel pit. It all ends up in the drinking water supply that the same people are drinking in their evenings when they turn on the tap. I would ask that villages like this be expedited over the life of this government. Give us the 21st century, even give us a 20th century sewerage infrastructure that we desperately need. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach. Deputy Joe Carey on the same issue.
On page 61 of the document, there is a commitment to invest in new sewerage schemes in small towns and villages. I'd like to ask the Taoiseach which particular department will lead in the development of these schemes. Will it be the Department of Planning and Local Government? Will it be the Rural and Community Development? We need a lead department to put a scheme in place to put this scheme in place so that villages and towns across County Clare, for example, in Broadford, in Labashida, in Curraclare, in Carrigaholt, can get the sewerage schemes that they deserve.
Yeah, I thank the deputies for the question. I would just say that, look, I think the Deputy Crowe said this was a shovel-ready project, and we will have the whole idea of the stimulus plan, along with more structural issues, is to try and get as much activity going in the next 6 to 9 months as we possibly can, and there will be a capital programme attached to the stimulus plan. And I would hope that projects of the kind that you have both identified could be accommodated in that plan. And that would obviously involve the department, involving with the local, with Irish Water and local authority and who's ever involved in the situation to get it going. Because we want projects of that kind dealt with. It sounds, to be frank, awful that that situation still pertains in Broadford. And I think that's not good enough. And therefore we must do everything we possibly can to end that situation and to deal with it. And hopefully the announcement of the capital element of the stimulus plan will give us an opportunity to do that.
Deputy Brendan Griffin.
Ceann Comhairle, and firstly I just want to say it's my first time putting a question to the Taoiseach since his appointment, and I want to wish him the very best for the future. I want to raise a commitment that's in the programme for government to expand the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan Scheme, and one of the issues that has arisen very recently is that people who are on the wage subsidy scheme and the pandemic unemployment payment are now seeing their applications stalled. I had a man in Kerry who had gone almost through the whole whole process and who is now being told he'll have to be back at work for 3 months before the process can continue, even though he is already back at work. I had a woman who was on to me who had a really difficult time getting qualification under the scheme because she had to jump through hoops that were really unimaginable from the lender of last resort, i.e. the state in this regard. This woman had no outstanding loans, a full-time job and a part-time job, and yet she still found it extremely difficult. I'm asking the Taoiseach if he will give priority to the matter, particularly in relation to the PUP and the wage subsidy scheme issue.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Deputy Murnan O'Connor on the same matter.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Over the last few years in the Shannon, I have raised the issue of the threshold to qualify to go on local authority housing lists, and I know you're aware that in nearly 10 years we have had no review. So I'm asking you now, Taoiseach, to do this review. Every local authority in Ireland needs this review, and I await your answer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Cairn
Taoiseach.
First of all, in relation to Deputy Griffin, I will have that issue has been raised with us, to be frank, and I know that the Ministers of Finance and Public Expenditure are alive to it. There are challenges in relation to it, obviously, in terms of the PUP payment and in terms of the wage subsidy, because the issue of the security of the job and so on is a consideration. But in terms of the rebuilding home loans, I would like to think that we could examine it with some degree of detailed consideration in terms of the potential of the individual to get over this current hurdle in terms of their current status, be it on the pandemic unemployment payment and more particularly on the wage subsidy.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And that those issues were alive. In terms of Deputy Murnan, I will ask the Minister to review that. You have been a long-standing campaigner in relation to that issue, that the threshold hasn't changed in 10 years.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
I'll follow that up.
Deputy Owen O'Brien.
Taoiseach, page 56 of the programme for government commits the government to strengthen the regulatory and enforcement mechanisms with regard to short-term letting. As I'm sure you know, the vast majority of short-term lets across the state are not compliant with the government's own regulations. The level of enforcement from local authorities are very low. So will you commit in the legislative programme to strengthen the regulations of short-term letting platforms, and in particular introduce a specific planning offence to fine platforms that advertise non-compliant properties? And also just to say, in fact, Minister O'Brien on the 6th of June or 6th of July of this year introduced a blanket ban on the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, where nobody in receipt of the wage subsidy scheme can draw down that loan until 3 months afterwards, contrary to what the Taoiseach has just told the Dáil.
Taoiseach.
First of all, I'll examine that issue in terms of the proposals that the deputies put forward, in terms of short-term lettings and in terms of strengthening enforcement and sections in relation to the advertising of lettings that are not compliant with the regulations.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes questions on promised legislation. 23 deputies were not reached today. If I carry forward those names until tomorrow, which I'm quite prepared to do, please don't anyone else indicate tomorrow, because it's highly unlikely that we'll get to you. We move now to Taoiseach's questions. Ceisna chun an Taoiseach agus tagan ceist iver a héin an seachta Mary Lou MacDonald. Taoiseach.
I had a very positive meeting with the Northern Ireland First and Deputy First Ministers at Stormont Castle on Thursday the 16th of July on my first visit to Northern Ireland since taking office. We discussed the importance of North-South and East-West relations across these islands, and I stressed this government's commitment to working closely with the democratic institutions in Northern Ireland and with the United Kingdom Government as co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. We spoke about the progress made in tackling COVID-19 by our respective administrations and the great challenges that remain. We agreed we would continue to work together on this, including through the Memorandum of Understanding between our respective Ministers for Health and Chief Medical Officers, and that we would closely monitor issues relating to international travel. In addition, we agreed to hold a plenary meeting of the North-South Ministerial Council in Dublin on the 31st of July to discuss the many important issues of common interest and concern across this island. I also took the opportunity to speak to the First and Deputy First Minister about the Shared Island Unit, which I am setting up in the Department of the Taoiseach, as set out in our programme for government. I stressed our commitment to working with all communities and traditions on the island to build consensus around a shared future. We also considered the latest position on the Brexit negotiations and agreed to work closely together on the many related issues of mutual concern. During my visit to Belfast, I also met with the leadership of the other parties who are in the executive. That is the SDLP, the Alliance Party and the Ulster Unionist Party. In each of these meetings, we had very useful discussions on the same issues that I covered with the First and Deputy First Minister. I also took the opportunity to call on the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis MP, who was in Stormont on the day of my visit.
Thank you.
MacDonald.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle, and thank you, Taoiseach, for that answer. Taoiseach, it is a very welcome development that the North-South Ministerial Council will meet next week. I hope it is now widely understood the value of that forum. I think it is true to say that the North-South Ministerial Council and indeed the All-Ireland infrastructure has been neglected for quite some time. I look forward and I hope that your engagement with the North, with the institutions, with all of the political parties will be positive, will be forward-looking. And I hope that next week when the North-South Ministerial Council meets, we can finally get some level of coherence in respect of an all-Ireland approach in this COVID-19 emergency. I think it should be recalled that for the purposes of animal health, this island operates as a single unit, and it is quite frankly inexplicable that when it comes to human health, that there is a controversy around adopting the same approach. My colleague, Joint First Minister Michelle O'Neill, raised with you in the meeting that you had her concerns in respect of that all-Ireland approach. She specifically instanced with you, Taoiseach, as you know, the whole area of travel and protections for the island. My own observation for what it is, well, she has informed me of this. My own observation for what it is worth is that the last government, in a caretaker capacity, was extremely passive dealing with the North and dealing with the whole necessity for a single island approach for public health safety. I hope that passivity will not be your chosen modus operandi, because we need you to be energetic and we need the impetus to come from Dublin to ensure that we actually get the correct approach. And by the way, that does not mean throwing brickbats at Sinn Féin. I mean, do that by all means if you wish to, but can I just remind you, there are 5 parties to the executive in the North, and that means, Taoiseach, when you meet with the Alliance and the SDLP and the UUP and all others, it's incumbent on you to make the case very strongly for the absolute necessity for the correct island-wide approach to protect the health of our people. This isn't a question of the constitutional issue. This isn't really even a jurisdictional issue in the wider sense. This is about public health. This is about biology. This is about a virus that has to be contained across the island. And the truth is, for any of us to be safe on this island, all of us have to be safe.
And that is why we must engage constructively and in a genuine way with all concerned, and accepting the realities that we are talking about 2 different jurisdictions, whether we like that to be the case or not. And I've been very straightforward in relation to this. I will not be partisan or politically partisan in my approach to the issues of the North and the Good Friday Agreement. I've made that clear to both the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. I've made it clear in my public announcements in the North. But in this Parliament, if issues are raised, by one party, and I don't want to be in any way partisan on COVID at all if we can avoid it. But the reality is that the North took a particular, like the UK did, and the North went with it in terms of the 59 countries. We did discuss it in a very reasonable way about the need to have oversight and to keep an eye on it in terms of its impact. But the more important point is that we want to develop as clear a coherence as possible in relation to the public health issue. But also we want to activate, if you like, the North-South agenda as part of the Good Friday Agreement, and also as part of the New Decade, New Approach Agreement. And I think there has been a welcome development on the public health side with the Memorandum of Understanding between both Chief Medical Officers. They're in touch with each other. I think we need to keep that level of engagement going. And then in terms of the North-South, that there are significant infrastructural commitments there on behalf of the Irish Government. And as Taoiseach, I want to follow those through proactively and energetically, and I will do that. And also to see how we can create new momentum within the existing North-South bodies, and then look at other areas where greater collaboration could take place. And one of those areas in particular that I'm interested in is health. And we discussed that with other parties as well, in terms of paediatric health, for example, and in terms of the National Children's Hospital ultimately, and the capacity to take an all-island approach, for example, in terms of heart surgery, cardiac surgery, or other major diseases, if you like, that would are rare situations that would need a population-based approach on the island to justify certain health services. Continuation of the cancer service in Altnagelvin for patients in Donegal and in that hinterland. So I think there's a lot of ground there on a practical level without becoming embroiled in any political rows. In my view, there's a lot of work to get on with in terms of doing things that are practical, that are to the mutual benefit of people living on the island, in the North and in the Republic. And that's how I intend to approach the North-South Ministerial Council, to see how we can approach that issue and indeed other issues as well.
Deputy MacDonald.
Thank you. Well, of course that ought to be the case, and it's no great surprise that I would be, and Sinn Féin would be, very much advancing the case of an all-Ireland approach. But I just want to put this to you, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit in which it is intended, because this is a constructive observation. You see, you cannot on the one hand look to the north and say, well, sure, look at what they've done, because Britain has a particular position and they've gone along with it. The island is partitioned. I mean, that's why we feel the long hand or the invisible hand at times of British influence on the island. You can't either simply rely on the Memorandum of Understanding. I'm well aware that there's a Memorandum of Understanding, and I'm well aware that it is insufficient for our purposes. You can't stand back passively and say, well, you know, it's a different jurisdiction, and at the same time advance the case, which I hope you're advancing, that for the purposes of public health, we are a single epidemiological unit. Like, you have to make up your mind, and it does have to be grounded in science and data and evidence and so on. And all of that evidence points to the fact that for this island to be safe, we need not oversight or a distant set of observations. We need an all-Ireland approach. So I want to ask you, Taoiseach, at the North-South Ministerial Council, and prior to it and after it, will you actively pursue that approach? Not simply make observations or cite to us in the Dáil that there's been a phone call from one chief medical officer to another. I would expect that that's happening, but that's not enough. We need a coherent single island approach, and will you work actively for that?
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Well, two things. I have to say to you, Deputy, I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't want to be having brickbats across the House on these issues. But the fact of the matter is that Sinn Féin did sign off on opening up Northern Ireland to 59 states in terms of countries in terms of the travel issue. You can't blame the UK on that alone. People signed off on it within Northern Ireland. Now, that does have implications for the Republic. And what I did at the meeting was, and there are two different public health jurisdictions, whether you like it or not. And there's no need to be calling in the good Lord now in terms of your responses. But the reality is, you can't have it both ways. You can't come in here condemning the government here for being far more conservative than what you as a party did and signed up for. And also, I have to say, you know, I do have experience in the past of North-South Ministerial Councils. Sorry? I remember. Yeah, and it was a very positive one. and it's one that I worked well with ministers from Sinn Féin, worked very positively and constructively with them. When I was a Minister for Education, for example, or indeed a Minister for Health, when they were respective, it was, I think, the late Martin McGuinness and then Barbara Ní Brún. I know how to handle myself in a North-South Ministerial Council. And what I think you should avoid is trying to politicise it in a partisan way in advance of the Council. Let's have respect for all who will be at that Council. And I will be energetic, I can assure you. And I will raise the issues carefully in terms of public health and forcefully in terms of the importance of the all-island approach in terms of public health. And it's something we have to work constantly at. But you'll get nowhere, by the way, if you think that if you just hector people or lecture people that they're all going to fall in line. I don't think that approach will work. Or taking the public position, you know, in advance of the meeting and saying it better be this way or no way. And I just think that's not the correct approach.
Can we move to question number 2? Deputy Barry Lou MacDonald again. Taoiseach. Sorry, Deputy Duncan Smith, yes?
Not order, clarification. If another member wants to come in on
yes,
is it raise the hand or?
Raise the hand.
Grant, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry?
Taoiseach, question 2, yes.
The National Economic and Social Council is an independent statutory agency operating under the aegis of my department. The Council analyses and reports on strategic policy matters relevant to Ireland's economic, social, environmental and sustainable development. The NESC is a valuable forum where economic, social and environmental issues can be discussed between a variety of actors and government departments. The Council's work focuses on the strategic and long-term views, and its current work programme comprises the following themes. Transition teams addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland, land use, land value and urban development, welfare and employment, climate change. In addition, to date in 2020 and in response to the COVID-19 crisis, the NESC Secretariat has published 7 working papers on COVID-19 across a range of issues, including the implications of COVID-19 on housing in Ireland, protecting enterprises, employment and incomes, and progressing sustainability in the context of COVID-19. Future Jobs Ireland 2019 also included a request for NESC to develop policy recommendations for how to manage the impact of economic transition on vulnerable workers and sectors. The research published in March this year provided a forward look at the economy in the context of a transition to a low-carbon and more digital future. The Council have identified recommendations which will help Ireland address challenges and embrace the significant opportunities. I present Council reports to Government prior to publication or prior to laying them before the Houses, as in the case of the annual reports. To date in 2020, the Council has published 1 report addressing employment vulnerability as part of a just transition in Ireland. I appoint members to the Council under the National Economic and Social Development Office Act 2006 and the NESC Alteration of Composition Order 2010, SI 603-210. Each of the following sectors nominates 3 representatives to the Council: business and employer interests, ICTU, farming and agricultural interests, community and voluntary sector, environmental sector. A further 6 members are public servants, mainly Secretaries General, and must include a representative of my department and the Department of Finance. The Secretary General of my department is the Chair of the Council, and an Assistant Secretary of my department is the Deputy Chair. There are also 7 independent members on the Council. The Council is funded through my department's vote, and my department also has governance responsibilities regarding the Council.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy MacDonald.
Taoiseach, the National Economic and Social Council published a paper last month on the implications of COVID-19 for housing in Ireland. And the paper argues that the crisis demonstrates the capacity of government to take swift and decisive action. They add that the introduction of legislation to ban evictions and rent increases and in securing additional accommodation for homeless households is the evidence of this. Another important point they note is the increased cooperation between official bodies and voluntary agencies in dealing with homelessness and their shared proactive approach to protecting homeless people from the virus. NESC warns that tenants who have built up arrears during the crisis are now exposed to eviction when the ban expires, and as a result believe it's important that it be extended. Yet despite this advice offered weeks ago from an agency under the aegis of your department, the Housing Minister saw fit to wait until literally the 11th hour to extend the ban by a miserly 10 days. Surely even you would accept, Taoiseach, that this is at best incompetence on the part of your Minister and at worst an indication of what is to come in terms of housing policy from your government. The dogs in the street know the tens of thousands of renters work in sectors of the economy that will not return to full employment this year. Some have yet to return to work at all due to public health guidelines, and your government's mishandling of this issue has added to the enormous uncertainty that they face. As Fianna Fáil housing spokesperson, the now Minister has had months to prepare for the extension of the ban on evictions and rent increases. This plan should literally have been top of his agenda when taking up his ministry, and we now understand that he will bring legislation to Cabinet tomorrow to be published on Friday. You know, Taoiseach, rent-related legislation is technical, and the previous minister had a reputation for rushing things through, legislation that turned out to be bad legislation. Your own housing minister criticised him, Owen Murphy, on that very point on more than one occasion. So our housing spokesperson, Owen O'Brien, has written to the Minister asking that he urgently brief the opposition on the proposed legislation, and yet the Minister has not agreed to this.
All right.
So I want to ask you, Taoiseach, will you progress this matter and ensure that this important legislation gets the scrutiny that is very, very necessary?
Thank you very much. There are supplementaries from Deputy Duncan Smith and Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, the NESC has done good work during COVID in relation to producing papers, and they've looked at examples of schemes in other states. In particular, looking at the short-time working scheme from Germany called the Kurzarbeit. It's with a view to replacing the temporary wage subsidy scheme and giving some kind of certainty to workers who really are concerned that when the TWSS finishes, that so could their jobs and their futures. So we in the Labour Party support a short-time working scheme being implemented, and in particular I'm thinking of the aviation sector, which, as we know, is going to be one of the last to recover. I want to ask you, Taoiseach, have you considered such a scheme? Have you engaged with the aviation industry in terms of such a scheme? I know Lufthansa in Germany have protected 21,000 jobs for cabin crew and ground staff by the provision of such a scheme. Why aren't we looking at the same here? Have the airline and aviation industry been asking you, or coming to your government, about such a scheme in terms of how to protect workers? And any clarification you could give would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, as has already been alluded to, NESC produced a paper in June on the implications of COVID-19 for housing. And they were clear and unequivocal in saying that the eviction ban and the rent increase ban should be extended. And I think it was very clear from the commentary in that report they didn't mean for 10 days. They pointed out, as part of their argument, quite correctly, the huge numbers of people who have suffered income loss or job loss may have built up arrears, and therefore, if the ban is lifted, there's a real danger that many people who've been impacted through no fault of their own by COVID-19 could find themselves facing eviction if there is not a much longer term extension of that ban. And I would remind the Taoiseach that Fianna Fáil supported the People Before Profit Solidarity anti-eviction bill in the last Dáil, which passed in the Dáil. The government obviously didn't want want to implement in the last government, but your party voted for it, which was to ban evictions on the grounds of sale, to prevent vulture funds and unscrupulous landlords using eviction as a way of maximising profit at the expense of tenants. So it's clear that NESC are alluding to that, and they're also alluding to the fact that they say again very clearly and categorically that homeless people who have seen their situation improve because of public health measures, getting own-door accommodation, that those measures should not be reversed. So this is a body that's funded by your department. Are you going to heed the advice on NESC and have a long-term extension on the eviction and rent increase ban to safeguard tenants, and not to reverse the improvements that some homeless people have got as a result of the pandemic measures?
Okay, thank you. Taoiseach.
Yeah, in the first instance, I think it's important to point out that the existing ban is by an SI, by regulation, and is grounded in the emergency legislation and in the emergency situation that happened in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak of COVID-19. The legal advice is very, very clear that it's not legally sound and is very, very open to challenge and doesn't offer the protection for the next while that people suspect it does. It doesn't. And so it has to be replaced. And the legislation that will be introduced is designed to prevent tenants who are unable to pay their rents due to the impact of COVID-19 are not, that they are protected from eviction for rent arrears. So the bill is designed to protect those who, as a result of COVID, could be vulnerable to becoming homeless. It's a much more targeted legislative approach, but it's through primary legislation which will give it much greater legal certainty and protection and security. And it will also strengthen and give a new role to the Residency Tenancy Board in terms of working with tenants in rent arrears, in terms of helping them to get support. I think the ESRI study, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's about 8,000 nationally who identified rent arrears as a result of COVID. So we're very keen and very clear, in terms of protecting tenants who are in difficulty as a result of COVID, and to protect them from eviction, and that's what the new legislation will do, and it will replace the SI that so far has been maintaining the ban in relation to evictions. In terms of the short-term working idea that Deputy Smith raised, first of all, I just want to say there won't be any cliff off the TWIS, and the stimulus programme that will be published or announced this week will actually outline the next phase, if you like, of TWIS, and how we intend to support workers in companies that currently utilise the TWIS, and that they would be, over a medium term, to be in a position to avail of TWIS or a similar scheme. Now, what you have suggested is interesting, and by all means, we would take a submission from you on it, or perhaps if you can write to me and write to Ministers Donoghue and McGrath, because later on that could be of some value. In the meantime, there won't be any cliff off the TWIS for companies, and the idea really is to give certainty over the medium term to companies and to workers in relation to their positions and their jobs.
Right, thank you, Taoiseach. We're running out of time now, so we can take a brief supplementary from
if I might,
MacDonald.
So, I mean, there's no secret, Taoiseach, that you've been hostile to the idea of rent freezes and bans on evictions. I mean, I recall during the election campaign you cited legal advice that said that a rent freeze would not be possible, and we all know that turned out not to be the case. Leaving that aside, what I asked you was whether or not the Minister would agree to briefing opposition housing spokespersons on the proposed legislation thus far, the Minister has refused to do that. I'm asking you as Taoiseach to intervene and to ensure that it happens, because it is important legislation and it's important that it has the requisite scrutiny.
Taoiseach?
We'll take issue with your word hostile. I'm not hostile to keeping rents as low as possible. We supported the rent, the areas that control rent in the various areas, and keeping rents as low as possible. And you use language like, should we all know now what's different between now and before the election? We don't all know, because no one knew during the election in relation to COVID-19. COVID-19 is what made this possible in the first 3 months, the rent freezes and the ban on evictions. Other than that, it would be very legally difficult to do what was done. It just wouldn't have been possible, actually. It's COVID-19 and the emergency gave rise to that. And we need truth from time to time, and not just disingenuous commentary that is just politically motivated. I'm for fair approaches and to protect people. And I want as wide an access to housing as possible, be it council housing, be it fair rents and affordable rents, and houses that people can buy in an affordable way, and to enable them to buy affordable houses. That's what my agenda is. So I'm not hostile to anything that would protect and help people who are renting in any shape or form. And I will talk to the Minister in terms of briefing the opposition. Obviously, the timelines are tight. The government's about 3 weeks in, 2.5. And there's a lot happening. And in fairness to him, this legislation is coming in to replace a statutory instrument that we have been advised is illegal.
Thank you, Taoiseach. We need to move on to question 3, please.
The Government Coordination Cabinet Committee was established by the Government along with 9 other Cabinet committees. I'm a member of the committee with the Taoiseach and the Leader of the Green Party. The Secretary-General to the Government, my Chief of Staff and the Chiefs of Staff for the Taoiseach and Leader of the Green Party also sit in on meetings. The committee has held 2 meetings to date, the 6th and the 13th of July. It meets in advance of government meetings. The committee was established to review the activity of cabinet committees, review the agenda for that week's government meeting, discuss political priorities, review implementation of a specified element of the programme for government.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Duncan Smith.
Taoiseach, I'd be interested to know, did the committee meet last night in advance of yesterday's cabinet meeting? Because as we know, the cabinet meeting was delayed by an hour and a half, I think, or maybe a little more. And I suppose the assumption, and maybe it's incorrect, was that in relation to the green list, what was articulated in public by your Taoiseach may have fed into a committee meeting and then delayed the cabinet meeting. So I'd be interested to know what discussions took place prior to the cabinet meeting or within the cabinet meeting on that comment by Taoiseach Varadkar. I think my opinions on the green list have been well publicised. I'm sure you're aware of them. The horse is now bolted. It's been published, and I think it's a mistake. I think even the language, the use of the word green list, I think is incorrect. Your Minister for Foreign Affairs was on the radio this morning on Morning Ireland, and he's a good communicator, and he articulated the rationale, which I listened to, but it still doesn't cover the gap between the medical advice, and it still doesn't cover the gap of lack of confidence that the public have in this. So I'll ask: has the committee discussed in any detail further measures to improve confidence, and what has the committee discussed in relation to what Dr. Ronan Glynn, our CMO, our still relatively new CMO, who's doing a tremendous job? What have the committee done to discuss what he said, that workplaces are the new front line of the COVID crisis? Has there been any cases that you're aware of people who have returned from a country, be it green list or red list, that have returned to work prior to a 14-day isolation period with the virus, and that has led to either a workplace being shut down or some measures being put in place? I'd be interested to know, are you aware, or is your committee aware of any instances of people who have returned from abroad and enter the workplace without restricting their movements or self-isolating for 14 days and have brought the virus into a workplace. I'd be interested to know if that's happened, how often it's happened, and if it has, why has it not engendered a stronger response from government in terms of measures for people coming in?
Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald.
And I too would like to know whether or not this coordination committee met in advance of last night's cabinet meeting. It was very clear yesterday that the Taoiseach acted as critic of his own government, or at the very least his own government colleague, in telling the media that it was wrong to send out mixed messages about international travel with regard to the green list, and he in fact questioned the value of having a green list at all. So was that matter thrashed out at the coordination committee, Taoiseach? And can I ask you on a separate matter, the proposal, it seems, to award an allowance of €16,288 to a third super junior minister. Of course, such an allowance is only envisaged for 2 super juniors, but it seems that you will bring forward legislation to allow for this payment to a third super junior minister. And can I put it to you, Taoiseach, that that's a fairly extraordinary decision to make at a time when you are also proposing to cut the payments, the COVID payments that so many workers and families rely on? Is it not something of an extravagance to award this very generous allowance to a third super junior minister at a time when families fear for their own income levels and wonder whether or not they will get back to normal working life in the near future?
Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Taoiseach, it's one thing to have a lack of coordination and coherence about foreign travel and green lists before a cabinet meeting, but it is quite something else to have that lack of coherence and coordination after the cabinet meeting where presumably you discussed this. And you see, you're just not acknowledging that what Simon Coveney said today didn't clarify matters, it confused matters more. What he said was that the green list included countries whose infection rate was at the same level of Ireland's or below, and I'm paraphrasing him but accurately, he said therefore it was as safe to go to those countries as it was to travel in Ireland. And then he goes on to say, but we think you shouldn't go there. But if you do go there, it's okay and you don't have to quarantine. Now, where is the coherence in that? And have you now become the experts on health advice? For him to say it is as safe to go to the green list countries as it is to travel here is, first of all, a signal for people to go. Why, if it's as safe, would you stop people from going? And why are NEFIT saying they shouldn't go? Presumably because they think it isn't safe to go. But your government spokesperson this morning said it's as safe to go as to travel in Ireland. Now, if that isn't a mess and a total lack of coherence and a total lack of coordination that leads to absolutely understandable confusion on the part of the public, I really do not know what is, Taoiseach.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
First of all, in relation to Deputy Duncan Smith's questions, the reason for the cabinet delay yesterday was we had a cabinet subcommittee on the stimulus plan involving ministers, myself, Taoiseach, and the leader of the Green Party, with a whole host of officials in coming to the final stages of the preparation of what will be a very comprehensive stimulus plan to create jobs. So I wouldn't read anything into the fact that we had to put the meeting back, because I'd come back from the Dáil yesterday as well, in terms of the duties I had here in terms of questions and so on. So the timelines were tight, and that explains that. Now, we did meet in advance of the Cabinet, which we do. That's the whole idea of and it's a Cabinet subcommittee. So in line with all cabinet subcommittees, I'm not in a position to reveal what happens at the meetings, but it goes through what's about to come up. And just in terms of the memo in relation to travel. I mean, that's been in preparation for quite some time, and the whole issue of international travel has been on the agenda now for about 2 months, more since the whole reopening started. And if you recall, about 2 weeks ago, we put back the decision in relation to international travel till the 20th. That was yesterday, or the day before yesterday. But because I got detained in Brussels for 4 days, that wasn't anticipated, we had to put everything back, and hence the meeting at 8 o'clock last evening. I had thought I'd be in Dublin on Monday morning, but I wasn't. So there's no big mystery to the fact that we've had cabinet meetings and we had to have one at 8 o'clock last night. There was no mystery to that. I just wasn't. I was in Brussels and wasn't in a position to be here Monday. Luckily got back on Tuesday in time for the Dáil. And the memo itself would have been in preparation last week and over the weekend. I would have had discussions over the weekend with others in relation to it, and these issues were being debated with and discussed with relevant ministers. And we had a very good meeting last night of the Cabinet on the issue. Very good meeting, and it was constructive and matter of fact. And I would say that, again, I have to state, I think there's and I listened to Deputy Boyd Barrett's comments in terms of, I think you're overstating it. I think there's a degree of hyperbole in what you're saying. The bottom line here is that these countries have a lower incidence than COVID-19, lower incidence of COVID-19 than Ireland has. People need to know that, and people need to know that as information. There is a need to advise people of what the state is in countries. Other countries are in a much worse situation. Overall, we're saying, the safest thing to do is to stay at home and have your holiday this year at Ireland, and that to me is fairly basic and fairly sensible. I wouldn't. I mean, we have a very restrictive travel regime at the moment in terms of our advice. Very, very restrictive. Travel is on the floor. Now, the next stage is we will be getting a call centre in place, the electronic locator form. The contact tracing is key. There will be randomised testing at airports, and we're exploring the issue of areas where there's a high incidence of COVID-19 to see how we can further protect our citizens from any potential dangers of people travelling from such locations in here, and how best to deal with that, both legally and sensibly in terms of life itself. Because remember, when people talk about travel from areas, and there's been some very tough stories as well in terms of families who can't get back, from countries. So travel isn't all about tourism. And even though in Europe, well, it's important, because in Europe, for example, they've had various advisories, but they've never banned a plane from landing anywhere, nor have we. And there's a reason for that, in terms of both workers, in terms of family members who work. We have people in Ireland who work in Europe, for example, who may want to get home for 2 or 3 weeks. And they're working on behalf of the state. So what is the message to those workers? That they come back and they have to quarantine mandatorily? They'll have to restrict their movements if they're from countries that are outside that list. But we just need a bit of balance in our debate about this. I gave figures earlier. Travel is on the floor compared to where it was a year ago. That doesn't take away the dangers of COVID-19 through travel. And I work with, and I talk to the Chief Medical Officer, great respect, and I work with him on this, and will continue to do so.
All right, thank you.
The government has to take a wider breadth of issues on board when it makes these decisions.
We've just a few minutes remaining. Deputy Duncan Smith, and I'll take supplementaries, yes. Deputy Smith.
Yeah, indeed, travel is on the floor. I mean, the airport's in my own constituency, so I'm keenly aware of that, Taoiseach. But I don't think any three of us are engaging in hyperbole here. Yeah, no, but in fairness, Deputy Boyd Barrett, in terms of his delivery, very confident and all that. What he's saying is spot on. It's exactly how I feel, and I think how Deputy MacDonald feels and how other people feel in this House. The issue is, by using the wording green light, it was saying, as green means go, as I said on the radio yesterday morning. So it was a political decision to give implicit permission, which is what that does. You could have just listed the list of countries that have lower rates per 100,000 on the government website, which has been a very good resource during this pandemic, and focused on a proper step approach to reopening travel. And in order to do that, confidence had to be given to our public, to our individuals, to our businesses. And we haven't stopped planes, and we're all aware of people who've had to come home for loved ones or people who are dying or for any reason. So we're all keenly aware of that. But we know on this side of the House that there has been a step change in the government's approach to this. And just to finish on the point again, and I hope you'll come back to it, we need to know how many people have come back with the virus and have gone into workplaces, and that is a key issue. If we are to have confidence in any regime that the government puts across, that is one area, as Dr. Ronan Glynn said, that is the new front line. Thanks, Taoiseach.
Well, I would echo all of those sentiments, and I would like you also to answer the question in terms of the allowance for the Super Junior, the third Super Junior Minister. Is it true that legislation will be brought forward? When and how on earth do you justify it? And if you would please answer it this time. Thank you.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Taoiseach, again to echo the sentiments of Deputy Smith and Deputy MacDonald. Of course, we are cognizant and sensitive to people in family situations of difficulty, having to get back, essential workers, and so on. That is not the point here. And indeed, it's not just the green light symbolism and what that signifies that Deputy Smith has referred to, although he's absolutely right on that. But you didn't answer my question. After all of this controversy, where there is clearly confusion, Simon Coveney went on the radio this morning and said, it is as safe from an infection point of view to go to these 15 countries as it is to travel in Ireland. That's what he said. Now, how do you tally that with saying, if it's as safe, why are you saying people can't go? Why are Neffet saying you can't go? Right? The two things do not fit together. Right? There is a direct contradiction. Either it's safe and you can go, or it is not safe and you shouldn't go. And since when, in terms of the application of public health advice, up until now, has it been the case that we say, this is what we want you to do, but you don't really have to do it? That's the message that's coming out at the moment. When there was a 2-kilometre restriction, we didn't say, listen, there's a 2-kilometre restriction, but you know, if you fancy going 3, 5 or 20, we don't really mind. That's the message that's coming out. And is it any wonder people are confused?
Thank you,
so
Deputy.
You need to clarify it, Minister. It's not clear to people, and people do not know what to do.
Thank you. Taoiseach, we have about 4 minutes to conclude.
First of all, in terms of any incidents, I'm not aware of any. I'll get the specifics on that. In terms of any incidents from travel back into the workplace that infected the workplace, there have been incidences in relation to travel, in terms of having a knock-on impact, and a lot of those were household impacts. You might have heard about the house party in Killarney, for example, and that's the bigger threat. Actually, is behaviour, how we behave in groups, how we behave as individuals. And I mentioned that earlier. Despite all the hype that's going on here, it boils down to individual behaviour and community behaviour, and how we shouldn't have 30 people in a party in a house. There shouldn't be 60 people in a party in a house. That's the fastest way to spread the virus. And if someone travels in from abroad with the virus and is at a party of 60 people or 70 people, that will spread it more quickly. So behaviour is key. And that's the story. But then we have to then get our contact tracing in place and our testing in place very quickly. And that is work that is ongoing. It has improved dramatically. It's up to 46,000 on 1 week before last, and I think that's very significant. And that will continue, and the results are speeding up. But we have to keep working on to get faster and better outcomes in relation to that. But I'll put that question and to CMO and come back to you in relation to that. And in terms of the I've already said last week in relation to that it's my view, if there's a position, and in this case it's a Super Junior position, there's either a rate for the job or there's not. And in my view, that matter will be regularised we have 3 super junior ministers, one being the chief whip, and that will be regularised because you're either a super junior at the cabinet table or you're not. In terms of Deputy Boyd Barrett's points, the key point here is that the incidence is lower in these countries than it is in the Republic. And you know, there's many. And by the way, in terms of public health advice and government decisions, this isn't new. That government takes decisions following advice from NEFIT, and that all of those decisions may not be fully in accordance with the advice. This is not new. This has happened in terms of the roadmap, for example. What did? And there'll be a construct. Look, in general, we have a line to public health advice. People, however, people have made their suggestions as to what they think should happen. Like I remember when people wanted the schools closed. People didn't want them closed that quickly, and then within days we were calling for them to be closed. So there's been this ongoing engagement, constructive engagement with public health in terms of the best thing. Look, take masks. I mean, public health advice earlier on would have been not to wear masks, and there was a certain reticence about using masks. I actually would have come out earlier in favour of masks, reading the scientific view in terms of the efficacy of masks. That's still probably disputed in the medical world, but not in. But more and more people and WHO are recommending it, and NEFIT recommended to us that we would now introduce it in terms of the consumer space and retail, and we will. And we did it in public transport, and I pushed it very hard that we got it done and stopped the various territorial battles that were going on and just said, I want the regulations in. And look what happened. The public very quickly, despite all the attempts to sow confusion. I could count all the commentary about, oh, this is confusing, who will implement it? No, hold on a second. The same comments were made. The bottom line is the public went and did the right thing.
All right, thank you, Taoiseach. The time is up. Thank you.
And I think just we need to see it in perspective as well. You know, and I think we still have one of the most cautious travelling regimes, in my view, in Europe and across the globe.
Okay, Gary Mila Magad Hishak Shindera Lakeshna Kunan Tishak, Go Mishirai, Ganishkdi and Kid, Pisa Gano Elish, Shin Roches, Thresh and Grenier, then Horle Orpach, Erin Shachto, Ochto, Neo, Agus and Fihula Yule. Tago or agus fihinómid agan den díosbúracht seo, agus Taoiseach tá denómad agat contús a chur leis an díosbúracht.
Of course, in Europe, and